The air at Danny Crawford's auction smelled like fall. October in Nebraska does that better than any other month. It blends the scent of dry corn husks with cold diesel and something else, something without a name, but every farmer in Merritt County knows it in their bones. The smell of an ending. It was around 2 in the afternoon when the crowd near the barn began to thin. People had taken what they wanted. The hand tools went in the morning, the grain truck at noon, the flatbed trailer with the new side panels in under 20 minutes. What remained were 3 rusted hulks in the far corner of the yard. John Deere 402s, 3 of them, sold as a single lot because separately they weren't worth a damn. Danny Crawford, the auctioneer, a man with a voice heavy and resonant as stone striking stone, had already called out the lot twice. No takers. He was looking at me. I was standing next to the nearest tractor with my palm flat on the engine block. Cold. A crack in the air filter housing. But the block itself was solid. I'd seen that the moment I pulled up in my truck an hour earlier. "Well, Clary!" someone hollered from the handful of people still lingering. "You buying that for scrap?" Laughter. "Scrap metal," Danny Crawford repeated, and there was no mockery in his voice, just a statement of fact. 3 units. John Deere 4020, 1972, 1971, and 1965. Condition, as you can see. "Who'll give me $100? Silence. 50? Silence. I raised my hand. 250 for all 3. Crawford paused, then paused a little longer. 250 once, 250 twice, sold. He brought the gavel down and looked at me the way you look at a man who's just done something he'll regret. "They're yours, Clary." I paid cash. 310. Crawford added 50 for the trailer to get them off the property by evening. As I pulled onto the road with 3 wrecked hulks on the flatbed behind me, the last thing I heard was laughter. Scrap metal. That's what Danny Crawford called them. And that's what every person in that dusty corner of Nebraska saw on that October afternoon. Every person but me. My name is Clarence Webb. Everyone calls me Clary, has since I was a kid. And I stopped correcting people a long time ago. I was 44 years old in the fall of '79, and 22 of those years I'd spent on this land. 320 acres in Merritt County that my father bought in '51, and that his father had worked on rented ground before that. The soil wasn't the best in the county, but it wasn't the worst either. A reddish-brown, sandy loam that held moisture a little better than geology had any right to give it, and put out corn at 120 to 140 bushels an acre in a good year. I knew every inch of it, and I knew tractors. Not because I'd read about them in books. I had one engine manual, worn to pieces, with oil stains on every page, and I'd read it maybe 20 times. I knew tractors because I'd been fixing them since I was 16. First my father's International Harvester 560, then the neighbor's machines. Over 20 years, enough iron had passed through my hands that I could close my eyes, listen to an engine, and tell you where the problem was. The neighbors knew it, and they came. I didn't charge much, sometimes cash, sometimes a sack of potatoes, sometimes just a handshake. That was enough for me. I lost the index finger on my right hand in '71. A combine, autumn fatigue, 1 second of inattention. Doc Hartley stitched it up clean. "You'll fix things better with 9 fingers than most men do with 10, he told me. He was right. By the fall of '79, my own tractor was in bad shape, an International Harvester 1466. Good machine, 8 cylinders, 150 horsepower, bought it in '73, paid it off over 3 years. But by '79, the transmission had finally given out, the second one in 4 years. There was nothing left to restore it with. I could fix anything, but parts cost money, and money was exactly enough to live on, not a cent more. A new John Deere 4240 cost $28,000. The bank in Central City offered a loan, 18% interest. The loan officer, a young guy in a tie who'd never held anything heavier than a manila folder in his life, told me those were favorable terms for the current market. I sat across from him for about 5 minutes, looked at his hands, then stood up and walked out. 18%. No, my neighbor Earl Dobbins bought a John Deere 4240 in September of 79, 31,500, with the cab, the air conditioning, and the extra hydraulic outlet. He drove home with the dealer's pennant on the antenna and made 2 slow laps around his fields on the new machine, slow enough that everyone could get a good look. Earl wasn't a bad man. He was a loud man. There's a difference, but it isn't always obvious when you're standing at the fence watching him turn his new tractor around, green and gleaming like a grasshopper the size of a house. 3 weeks later, I was standing at Crawford's auction with 3 rusted hulks. I brought the first one home and set it under the lean-to, stripped the second down right there in the yard, left the third on the trailer for the time being. The lean-to was full. The neighbors started stopping at the fence within the first week, some out of curiosity, some because in Merritt County, in December, there isn't much to do, and Clarence Webb, who bought that scrap at auction and is out there doing something with it in 20-degree weather. Well, that's at least some kind of entertainment. Earl Dobbins showed up the first Saturday in December, parked his pickup at the gate, got out, lit a cigarette, and stood there a long time watching what I was doing. I was pulling the cylinder head off the first wreck. It's delicate work. The bolts had seized solid, and you couldn't afford to strip the threads. "Clary," he said finally, "you serious?" "Serious about what?" I asked, not looking up from the work. "Serious about actually making something out of this?" I didn't answer. It was a rhetorical question, and Earl wasn't expecting one. "I've been telling people," he continued, addressing himself now less to me and more to Gary Norris, who had also stopped at the fence to listen. "Clarence Webb is building a tractor the way kids build Frankenstein. A little from each one. Head from one, arms from another, legs from a third." He laughed. Gary smiled politely. "Except Frankenstein at least moved. This thing, it won't." I lifted the cylinder head off, set it on the workbench, inspected the mating surface. Clean, not a crack. "Going home, Earl," I said. "I've got work to do." He left. The nickname Farmer Frankenstein stayed. By Christmas, everyone in the county had heard it. Ruth found the invoice from the parts supplier at the end of February. I'd ordered hydraulic cylinder seals, new piston rings, and a full gasket set. $840. Not a small sum for February, when the fields are under snow and money only flows one direction. Out. She came into the barn that evening, set a mug of coffee on the workbench, and laid the invoice beside it. Didn't say a word. I wiped my hands on a rag and picked up the paper. "Do you know what you're doing?" she asked finally. "I do." "Then explain it to me." I did, without rushing, because Ruth deserved that. She deserved me not to rush. The first tractor was a 67, the engine. The block was perfect, not a single crack. The crankshaft journals within spec, the cylinder liners in good shape. That engine could run another 20 years. The transmission was dead. The housing had been shattered in a wreck. No fixing it. The second tractor was a 71. The transmission, 8-speed with a creeper gear. I'd pulled it apart completely. The gears were sound, the synchronizers were alive, the case had no cracks. It was the best transmission I'd ever seen in any 4020. The engine was burned beyond saving. The front axle had been crushed in a rollover. The third tractor was a 65. The front axle, old but right. No cracks. The kingpins within spec. The steering knuckles needed to be rebuilt, but that was straightforward work. The engine had seized from oil starvation and wouldn't turn. The transmission, I hadn't looked at it yet. "So," Ruth said, "you have 3 broken tractors and each one has one good part." "That's right." "And you want to build one working tractor out of them." "I'm already building it." She was quiet a long time. Outside the barn window, the evening was coming down, and the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling swayed in the draft. "How much more money is it going to take?" she asked. "Hard to say exactly. There are parts I'll order. There are parts I might find. I'm thinking another 1,000, maybe 1,200. And then it'll work? If I'm right about what I've got, yes. She picked up her mug, stood, walked toward the door. All right, she said, without turning around. For 3 days, she didn't come into the barn. On the fourth, she brought coffee and set it beside the workbench, the way she always had. We never talked about it again. The spring meeting of the Merritt County Farm Bureau usually covered 3 things: grain prices, credit programs, and weather. In April of 1980, a 4th item was added: Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Wheat and corn prices were falling. The conversation was anxious. Earl Dobbins spoke in the middle of the meeting. He knew how to talk. Loud, confident, with pauses in all the right places. He talked about the market, about politics, about how a good farmer needs good equipment to operate efficiently in any climate. The room nodded. Then someone, Roy Hickman, I think, though I'm not certain, asked Earl about the credit. Credit is a tool, Earl said. You've got to know how to use a tool. Not go around building a tractor out of 3 busted ones like some people do. He didn't look in my direction, but the pause was timed perfectly. You all heard about the farmer Frankenstein? He added. Laughter. Quiet at first, then louder. Someone asked for details. Earl obliged. Vivid, thorough. $310 for 3 wrecks. Working all winter in the barn. The nickname. I was sitting in the 3rd row. I looked at my hands, at 9 fingers, at the oil worked so deep under the nails it never fully comes out. I waited for a pause. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out without saying a word. Outside it was April, slushy with the promise of warmth that hadn't arrived yet. I got in my truck and drove home, pulled into the yard, went into the barn, turned on the light, and picked up a wrench, worked until 2 in the morning. By June of 1981, the tractor was almost ready. I say almost because in mechanics that word means the hardest part is still ahead. The engine was assembled. New piston rings installed, valves lapped, every gasket replaced. The transmission from the 2nd wreck fit perfectly. It was from the same production run as the block. They were built for each other. The front axle from the 3rd tractor I'd rebuilt from the ground up. Kingpins, steering knuckles, bearings. Painted it a flat gray. Not for looks, just to keep the rust off. The hydraulics worked. The 3-point hitch seated up clean. I'd even found a decent seat at a swap meet in Columbus. $8. That's when I found the crack. Cylinder head. Between the coolant passages and the oil gallery. A hairline fracture. I caught it by accident. Under pressure from the cooling system, it wept a thin film of oil. It was a June evening. I sat on a wooden crate next to the tractor and stared at the wall. Outside, beyond the barn wall, it was summer. Cicadas. A warm breeze carrying the smell of young corn. Ruth was probably watching television. Somewhere in the distance, a truck was running on Highway 30. A new cylinder head for a 4020 was $220 from the authorized dealer. A rebuilt one. $150 if you got lucky finding one. And another 3 weeks of waiting. I could have said, that's it just isn't meant to be. Sold what I had for parts. Maybe come out $300 ahead of what I'd put in and made my peace with it. But I couldn't. Not because of pride, though there was that too, but because the fields were waiting. August was waiting, harvest was waiting, and without a tractor, I couldn't do a thing. That same night, I called Harold Birch. Harold lived 12 miles north. An old man, 80 years old, alone on his farm. His son had moved to Omaha and never come back. Harold had managed by himself as long as he could, and then he'd simply stopped farming, left the fields fallow, kept some chickens, and read his Bible. I knew he had a wrecked 4020 sitting in his yard. It had rolled during transport about 6 years back. Harold never sold it, just left it there, like a monument, like something you're not ready to let go of. I called at 11:30 at night. Harold answered on the first ring. Old men sleep poorly. Harold, this is Clarence Webb. Sorry for calling so late. That's all right, Clary. I'm not sleeping. Harold, you've got that 4020 in your yard, the wrecked one. I do. I need a cylinder head. If it's intact, can I have it? A pause. Come out and have a look, he said. If it's good, take it. It's no use to me. What do you need for it? Help me with harvest. I've got 20 acres of oats and nobody to cut them. Done. I went out the next day. The cylinder head was perfect. Not a crack, not a sign of overheating. The tractor had gone over on its side, but the block had come through without damage. I pulled the head, loaded it in the truck, shook Harold's hand. 3 weeks later, I cut his 20 acres of oats, a fair trade. September 8th, a Tuesday. I stood in front of the tractor in the barn holding the ignition key. Ruth stood at the door, in her housecoat, a mug in her hands. She'd gotten up with me at 5 without a word, just put the coffee on and followed me out. The tractor stood on its own wheels for the first time since I'd hauled those 3 wrecks home 2 years ago. Gray, unpainted, no badge. I'd pulled it off one of the hulks, but it was bent, and I hadn't bothered to put it back. Just bare metal, oil, and nearly 2 years of work. I climbed up, checked the oil, normal, checked the coolant, normal, switched on the power, the gauges came to life. I hit the starter, the engine cranked, didn't catch, again. Cranked, caught, died. I waited 30 seconds. Checked the fuel at the filter, everything fine. Third time. The engine cranked, caught, roared high for a moment, and settled into a steady working idle. A 6-cylinder diesel, 404 cubic inches, 115 horsepower. It was running. I took off my glasses, wiped them on the tail of my shirt, put them back on and stared at the instrument panel for a long time. Oil pressure, normal. Temperature, climbing right. RPM, smooth, no stumble. I didn't say anything. Ruth didn't say anything. I put it in first and drove out of the barn onto the morning field. Paul Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 21% in June of 1981. It was the decision that killed inflation and nearly killed American farming with it. Corn in 1982 was going for $2.25 a bushel. In 1974, it had been $3.80, an 8-year drop of 40%, while costs kept climbing. Earl Dobbins was paying $480 a month on his John Deere 4240. I knew it from the signs you pick up without anyone having to tell you. Not because Earl said a word, but in a small county, people know. They know when First National Bank in Central City has sent a reminder notice. They know when Earl sold 2 bulls in November. Not planned, but sold. They know when his wife Martha stopped making her shopping trips to Columbus every other week. My tractor ran its first full season in 1982. Spring plowing, planting, cultivation, harvest. 825 engine hours for the year. Not one serious breakdown. Just a fuel filter change and 1 hose clamp tightened in the cooling system. Final cost through the end of 82. 3 wrecks, $310. Parts, $1,160. Consumables over 2 seasons, $120. Total, $1,590. A running John Deere 4020 in 1982 sold for somewhere between $14,000 and $17,000. The auctions in 1983 ran all across the county. It wasn't an exception anymore. It was the routine. Every Saturday somewhere in Merritt County, an auctioneer's flag went up and neighbors came to watch another man's life go off piece by piece. I didn't like auctions. Never had. But I went to Earl Dobbins's auction. Not out of satisfaction at his expense. I want to be honest with myself. There may have been some of that. But the main thing was different. I knew Earl was selling tools, and I'd been needing a few specific things for the shop for a long time. October 18th, morning cold and clear. The Dobbins yard was full, more people than I expected. It wasn't just buyers, it was neighbors. Come to watch the John Deere 4240 with the dealer's pennant go. The tractor sold for $19,000. Earl had paid $31,500. 4 years. And he'd lost $12,500. plus interest on the loan, plus insurance. I stood off to the side and watched the buyer climb into the cab. A young farmer from a neighboring county, clearly pleased with the price he'd gotten. The new owner put it in gear and drove away. Earl was standing next to Martha. He wasn't watching the tractor go. He was looking at the ground. Then they started selling the tools. I bought what I'd come for: a snap-on socket set, a set of spring compressors, an old 3-ton floor jack, $42 in all. Good tools, well kept. Earl took care of his things. That I'd always known. At the end of the auction, I walked over to him. He looked at me, waiting for something. Mockery, maybe, or sympathy he didn't want. "Earl," I said, "Clary." I was quiet for a second. The words you want to say in moments like that are usually not the words that are needed. "You're a good farmer, Earl. Always have been. Machines come and go. You're still here. The land didn't go anywhere. That means there's still plenty ahead." He was looking somewhere past me, toward the place where his green 4240 had been standing just a few minutes before. Then he nodded slowly. Once, quietly, as though to himself. I shook his hand and walked to my truck. October in Nebraska is the best month. I know I described it differently at the start, but that depends on which side you're looking from. If you're on the losing end, October smells like an ending. If you're on the other side, it smells different. There's a difference. I drove home from the auction on Highway 30 and the sun was sitting low, the way it always does in October, like it's tired and wants to turn in early. The fields on both sides were stripped and harvested, golden gray, stubble standing in rows. Back at the house, I parked the truck, got out, and went into the barn. There it was, my tractor. Gray, no badge, 87,000 hours on the clock, its own and borrowed from previous lives. I sat down in the $8 seat from the swap meet in Columbus. If you're wondering whether I was thinking anything profound at that moment, no. I was thinking that I needed to change the oil before winter, that the left headlight was flickering and I needed to check the connection, that Ruth had probably already put supper on. Then I laid my hand on the steering wheel. Worn rubber, cold, the block from the 67 engine, the transmission from the 71, the axle from the 65, the cylinder head, Harold Birch's gift for 20 acres of oats. I didn't owe a single bank a single cent, not on this tractor, not on the land, not on anything. The land had been paid for by my father, the tractor had been paid for by me, $1,590 cash, 2 years of work, and one set of tools handed back to a neighbor. The $14,000 between what a tractor like this would have cost on the open market and what it cost me, that wasn't an abstraction. That was $14,000 that didn't go to a bank. That was $14,000 that got me through the crisis of '83 while other people were selling off things they loved. The neighbors called me Farmer Frankenstein. Fine by me. I climbed down from the tractor, turned off the barn light, and went inside. Ruth had put braised beef with potatoes on the table. We ate without much talking. Not because we had nothing to say, but because after a long day, silence is a conversation too. Later, while she was washing the dishes and I was sitting at the table with my mug, she asked, "How's Earl doing?" "He's holding on," I said. She nodded, didn't ask anything more. Outside was October in Nebraska, flat and dark and endless. Somewhere out there stood a gray tractor without a badge, built from junk but alive. I think I earned the right to stay on this land. If you've ever known someone like that, a person who did the impossible instead of taking out a loan, share it in the comments. There were a lot of people like that. Their stories deserve to be remembered.